The law of navigation. Anyone can steer the ship, but it takes a leader to chart the course. In 1911, two groups of explorers set off on an incredible mission. Though they used different strategies and routes, the leaders of the teams had the same goals: to be the first in history to reach the South Pole. Their stories are life and death illustrations of the law of navigation. Though one group was led by Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen. Ironically, Amundsen had not originally intended to go to Antarctica. His desire was to be the first man to reach the North Pole. But when he discovered that Robert Peary had beaten him there, Amundsen changed his goal and headed toward the other end of the Earth. North or south, he knew his planning would pay off. Amundsen carefully charted his course. Before his team ever set off, Amundsen had painstakingly planned his trip. He studied the methods of the Eskimos and the other experienced Arctic travelers, and determined that their best course of action would be to transport all their equipment and supplies by dog sled. When he assembled his team, he chose expert skiers and dog handlers. His strategy was simple. The dogs would do most of the work, as the group traveled 15 to 20 miles in a 6-hour period day. That would afford both the dogs and the men plenty of time for daily rest prior to the following day's travel. Amundsen forethought and attention to detail were incredible. He located and stocked supply depots all along the independent route. The way they would not have to carry every bit of their supply with them the whole trip. He also equipped his people with the best gear possible. Amundsen had carefully considered every possible aspect of the journey, thought it through, and planned accordingly. And it paid off. The worst problem they experienced on their trip was an infected tooth that one man had to have extracted. Scott violated the law of navigation. The other team of people was led by Robert Falcon Scott, a British naval officer who had previously done some exploring in the Antarctic area. Scott's expedition was the antithesis of Amundsen's. Instead of using dog sled, Scott decided to use motorized sledges and ponies. The problem began when the motors on the sledges stopped working only 5 days into the trip. The ponies didn't fare well either in those frigid temperatures. When they reached the foot of the Transantarctic mountains, all of the poor animals had to be killed. As a result, the team members themselves ended up hauling the 200-pound sledges. It was arduous work. Scott hadn't given enough attention to the team's other equipment either. Their clothes were so poorly designed that all of the men developed frostbite. One team member required an hour every morning just to get his boots onto his swollen, gangrenous feet. Everyone became snowblind because of the inadequate goggles Scott had supplied. On top of everything else, the team was always low on food and water. That was also due to Scott's poor planning. The depots of supplies Scott established were inadequately stocked, too far apart, and often poorly marked, which made them very difficult to find. Because they were continually low on fuel to melt snow, everyone became dehydrated. Making themselves even worse was Scott's last-minute decision to take along a fifth man, though they had prepared enough supplies for only 4. After covering a grueling 800 miles in 10 weeks, Scott's exhausted group finally arrived at the South Pole on January 17, 1912. There they found the Norwegian flag flapping in the wind, and a letter from Amundsen. The other well-led team had beaten them to their goal by more than a month. If you don't live by the law of navigation. Scott's expedition to the pole is a classic example of a leader who could not navigate for his people. But the trek back was even worse. Scott and his men were starving and suffering from scurvy, yet Scott, unable to navigate to the very end, was oblivious to their plight. With time running out and the food supply desperately low, Scott insisted that they collect 30 pounds of geological specimens to take back. More weight to be carried by the worn-out men. The group's progress became slower and slower. One member of the party sank into a stupor and died. Another, Lawrence Oates, a former army officer who had originally been brought along to take care of the ponies, had frostbite so severe that he had trouble doing anything. Because he believed he was endangering the team's survival, he purposely walked out into a blizzard to keep from hindering the group. Before he left the tent and headed into the storm, he said, "I'm just going to go outside. I may be sometime." Scott and his final two team members made it only a little farther north before giving up. The return trip had already taken 2 months, and still they were 150 miles from their base camp. There, they died. We know their story only because they spent their last hours updating their diaries. Some of Scott's last words were these. Before I say that, I just want to read the box. Because Robert Falcon Scott was unable to live by the law of navigation, he and his companions died by it. So Scott's last words were these. "We shall die like gentlemen. I think this will show that the spirit of pluck, power to endure, has not passed out of our race." Scott had courage, but not leadership. Because he was unable to live by the law of navigation, he and his companions died by it. Followers need leaders able to effectively navigate for them when they're facing life and death situations and necessity is painfully obvious. But even when consequences aren't as serious, the need is also great. The truth is that nearly anyone can steer the ship, but it takes a leader to chart the course. That is the law of navigation. Navigators see the trip ahead. Former General Electric Chairman Jack Welch asserts, "A good leader remains focused. Controlling your direction is better than being controlled by it." Welch is right, but leaders who navigate do even more than control the direction in which they and their people travel. They see the whole trip in their minds before they leave the dock. They have vision for getting to their destination. They understand what it will take to get there. They know who they'll need on the team to be successful. And they recognize the obstacles long before they appear on the horizon. Leroy Ames, author of Be the Leader You Were Meant to Be, writes, A leader is one who sees more than others see, who sees farther than others see, and who sees before others do." The larger the organization, the more clearly the leader has to be able to see ahead. That's true because sheer size makes mid-course corrections more difficult. And if there are errors in navigation, many more people are affected than when a leader is traveling alone or with only a few people. The disaster shown in James Cameron's 1997 film Titanic was a good example of that kind of problem. The crew could not see far enough ahead to avoid the iceberg altogether, and they could not maneuver enough to change course once the object was in view because of the size of the ship. The result was that more than 1,000 people lost their lives. In a little box right here it says, "A leader is one who sees more than others see, who sees farther than others see, and who sees before others do." Leroy Ames. Where the leader goes. First-rate navigators always have in mind that other people are depending on them and their ability to chart a good course. I read an observation by James A. Autry in Life and Work, A Manager's Search for Meaning, that illustrates this idea. He writes that occasionally we hear about the crash course of 4 military planes flying together in a formation. The reason for the loss of all 4 is this. When jet fighters fly in groups of 4, one pilot, the leader, designates where the team will fly. The other 3 planes fly on the leader's wing, watching him and following him wherever he goes. Whatever moves he makes, the rest of his team will make along with him. That's true whether he soars in the clouds or smashes into a mountaintop. Before good leaders take their people on a journey, they go through a process in order to give the trip the best chance of being a success. Navigators draw on past experience. Every past success and failure you've experienced can be a valuable source of information and wisdom, if you allow it to be. Success teach you what you're capable of doing and give you confidence. However, your failures often teach greater lessons. They reveal wrong assumptions, character flaws, error in judgment, and poor working methods. Ironically, many people hate their failures so much that they quickly cover them up instead of analyzing them and learning from them. As I explain in my book, Failing Forward, if you fail to learn from your mistakes, you're going to fail again and again. Why do I even mention something that seems so basic? Because most natural leaders are activists. They tend to look forward, not backward. Make decisions and move on. I know this because that is my tendency. But for leaders to become good navigators, they need to take time to reflect and learn from their experiences. That's why I have developed the discipline of reflective thinking. I write about it in detail in my book, Thinking for a Change. But allow me to give you some advantages of reflective thinking here. Reflective thinking gives you a true perspective. Reflective thinking gives you emotional integrity to your thought life. Reflective thinking increases your confidence in decision making. Reflective thinking clarifies the big picture, and reflective thinking takes a good experience and makes it a valuable experience. Each benefit gives a leader a great advantage when planning next steps for a team or organization. Navigators. Examine the conditions before making commitments. Drawing on experience means looking inward. Examining conditions means looking outward. No good leader plans a course of action without paying close attention to current conditions. That would be like setting sail against the tide or plotting a course into a hurricane. Good navigators count the cost before making commitments for themselves and others. They examine not only measurable factors, such as finances, resources, and talent, but also intangibles such as timing, morale, momentum, culture, and so on. I'll discuss this more in the laws of intuition and timing. No matter how much you learn from the past, it will never tell you all you need to know for the present. Navigators listen to what others have to say. No matter how much you learn from the past, it will never tell you that you need to know for the present, what you need to know for the present, all that you need to know for the present. No matter how good a leader you are, you yourself will not have all the answers. That's why top-notch navigators gather information from many sources. For example, before Roald Amundsen's expedition to the South Pole, he had learned from a group of Native Americans in Canada about warm clothing and Arctic survival techniques. Those skills and practices meant the difference between failure and success for his team in Antarctica. Navigating leaders get ideas from many sources. They listen to members of their leadership team. They talk to the people in the organization to find out what's happening on the grassroots level. And they spend time with leaders from outside the organization who can mentor. They always think in terms of relying on a team, not just themselves. Navigators make sure their conclusions represent both faith and fact. Being able to navigate for others requires a leader to possess a positive attitude. You've got to have faith that you can take your people all the way. If you can't confidently make the trip in your mind, you're not going to be able to take it in real life. On the other hand, you also have to be able to see facts realistically. You can't minimize obstacles or rationalize your challenges and still lead effectively. If you don't go in with your eyes wide open, you're going to get blindsided. As Bill Esom, president of Esom Bandy and Associates, observes, realistic leaders are objective enough to minimize illusions. They understand that self-deception can cost them their vision. Jim Collins confirmed this balance between faith and fact in his 2001 book, Good to Great, he calls in the Stockdale Paradox. He writes, "You must retain faith that you will prevail in the end, and you must also confront the most brutal facts of your current reality." Balancing optimism and realism, intuition and planning, faith and fact can be very difficult. But that's what it takes to be effective as a navigating leader.